Good morning, Year 11. Hopefully you can see the screen that I can see, and you can see me off in the side there. You'll notice that this particular screen doesn't have any animations, and I do apologize about that. This is the second lesson in the sequence. It's the dawn of civilization, and as you can see there, the multiple question, the sub-question that we always have is how it took place and the effect it had on the development of medicine. And the idea behind this is basically to talk in more general terms about how everything works. It's just dawned on me if I, hang on. In case you hadn't noticed, I'm doing this at home. You can see my lovely bookshelves behind me filled with, the standard annuals. If you look really closely, you'll be able to see Beanos and all sorts, and beyond that, you can see children's games. Hang on. There we go. So what can I say about the dawn of civilization? Well, the first thing you need to know, and I think I've already touched on this in a previous thing, is this idea that it differs due to region as to when this takes place, and a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case. One of these is climate, so the basic weather patterns, what the kind of vegetation is, what kind of area you're living in, and there's a good reason why civilization begins where it begins. Now, I said before that I have an issue with the word civilization. What I'm using it to mean here is settled and more modern ways of agriculture and a society that tends to have a hierarchy. Now, I realize this doesn't necessarily translate well to society and doesn't necessarily translate well to the idea of civilization, but I don't necessarily mean culture. I don't necessarily mean somehow superior to what had gone before or superior to anything else, though the word has those connotations, and that in itself is fascinating. One of the reasons civilization has the connotations that it does is because so many people like to think of themselves as, well, civilized. There's a certain, what's the word, snobbishness attached to the word. I try to use it in a non-snobby way, but you will see that the course that I'm talking about tends to use it in that very snobby way. Now, obviously there's an oversimplification here. This is not ancient history writ large. You will see that when I talk about ancient Egypt and when I talk about ancient Rome, I don't differentiate between the different periods so much. Mr. Cuthbert would turn in his, well, bed, I assume, because he's not dead, but he would be very upset by how I treat the Romans. I'm going to do it in a very sort of broad sweep fashion. As is my way, I have a very generalized view of history. I have an idea of using themes and thematics, and you'll see this this will feed forward into things like, Russia in year 13, for example, or even the British Political History unit in year 12. If you're not thinking of doing history, then this is still a useful way of looking at things in the round, as it were. So climate, also the type of society. We tend to find that civilization comes first to more patriarchal societies than perhaps were the norm when we're talking about things like Stonehenge. There's an assumption that these societies are very patriarchal, but we do know that in the Mesolithic, for example, there were many people that were keeping track of time, and they were keeping track of time on thigh bones, and there are 28 notches on those thigh bones. It's the earliest form of month. Now, some of you will have already gathered where I'm going with this. It appears the people keeping track of the dates weren't men. This implies, at least to me, but not all scholars agree, that there may have been more of an impact of women. We also know, and you've heard me say before, that women are magic. We also know that people used to collect things such as menstruation fluid because it attracts prey animals and it scares away animals that prey on human beings. So, to my way of thinking, I would anticipate that Mesolithic society at least had a more matriarchal approach than, say, civilized society. What we find with civilizations and when that arrives is that society tends to be patriarchal. We find most of the time that men are in charge. The third thing, and this is linked to climate, I suppose, is soil quality. It has to be incredibly fertile, and it has to be very quick growing. You have to be able to grow many crops in a very short space of time. One thing you've got to bear in mind is that early crops, early agriculture was based on things like wheat that only had maximum 4 heads on that wheat. Modern wheat, for comparison, has around 48. So you had to grow more of them in order to have the same yield. And that meant you had to have a very fertile area to grow things. If you didn't have that fertile soil, you couldn't have the multiple crops. You simply couldn't settle. You wouldn't be able to survive in any length of time. So as a consequence, soil quality plays a huge role in where and when civilization occurs. There are three main areas that you need to know about, that I'm going to talk about, that I'm knowledgeable about. The first is Mesopotamia. That is modern-day Iraq and Iran. It's that area around Kuwait. It's that Fertile Crescent area. And that is, as I say, the modern-day Middle East. We find civilization, we find records, written records, from around about 3,500 BC. One of these has recently been translated just this last year, and it shows a form of geometry and use of pi, for example, that is far superior to our own, implying that these Mesopotamians, these civilizations that were setting themselves up in the Fertile Crescent, actually were pretty good at what they did and were possibly better than us in many ways in terms of mathematics, certainly more simple. And what we do find, a lot of the early tablets that we have translated tend to be receipts. So we know they were using writing for other reasons. We simply don't know what they were writing on. It could well be that they're writing on material that doesn't survive. It could well be that they've been writing for thousands of years by this point. But the earliest records we have are around 3,500 BC. And so that's where our story begins, because that's the earliest point we've got things that we can actually point to and say, well, this is something to do with the why of why they do things. You'll remember when we were talking about Stone Age tribes, when we were talking about prehistory in general and the Neolithic, we said that a lot of things had no explanation. Well, now we have writing, there is some explanation. This arrives in Egypt, modern-day Egypt and Sudan, along the River Nile, around about 3000 BC. There are fragments from earlier settings, but mostly it's from 3000 BC that we date the Egyptian civilization. And I realize that even this has its issues in terms of dating, but don't worry too much about that. The point here is to try and explain why things happen where they happen and why things happen when they happen, and to use what little we know about ancient civilizations to try and set a baseline. We sort of started a baseline when we were talking about prehistory, the Neolithic and the Mesolithic, but a lot of that didn't have a lot of explanation. The next one we know about is India in 2500 BC, the Sultanate of India. And again, this is the earliest form of record. We've got records that tell tales. We've got, you might have heard about them in RS, actually, come to think about it. You've heard about the story of the Festival of Lights. You've heard when you went to the Mandir, how the story of the demons and oh, now you got me. Hammurabi, the monkey, and I cannot remember the main characters' names. It's not Ra. Nah, it'll come to me later. But the Sultanate of India is the earliest point at which they start writing things down that make sense and that we can use to try and analyze civilizations. Again, there are fragments that are earlier, but it's very, very hard to work out what they're talking about. The fourth and final bit is China and Japan. And the problem with China and Japan isn't that they didn't civilize early. We know they did. It's simply that there's a paucity of evidence. We have a lot of secondary sources, that is, people writing long after the fact, referring to sources that they knew existed, that we don't. So we know that early Chinese and Japanese civilizations were taking place. We know that they were potentially earlier than the West. We also know that they were potentially quite sophisticated and quite powerful. What we don't know is what they recorded their information on. The earliest records we have were written on turtle shell, for example, and that seems an odd choice. Seashells were often used, we know that too, but previous to that, we don't know what they were writing on. We assume they don't have writing, but again, this is one of those philanthropic assumptions, the assumption that these people, because they don't write or they haven't left writing, they don't have it. You can probably guess that I don't hold with that very much. But the point is, all of these areas at different times became what we refer to as civilized. That is, they became settled, they became agricultural, they became societies with a hierarchy with a top and a bottom and a middle area. They became triangular in shape, I suppose. When we're talking about Mesolithic, when we're talking about Neolithic tribes, we tend to assume that they're kind of straight. You get a couple of chieftains. People always talk about chiefs. People always talk about the priests. When really what I think they're talking about is communal organizations. So when we're talking about the ditches of Avebury, for example, there were the Mavericks, and they dug a ditch in a very different way to everybody else, to the same standard, to the same depth, to the same height of bank on the outside, implying that this is a much more level playing field. Whereas when you get to civilization, when you get to these societies in India and Egypt and Mesopotamia and China, you end up with a more sort of pyramid shape. You You end up with people at the top, you end up with people at the bottom, and you end up with people in between. So civilization tends to mean hierarchy. And if you've looked down the second side here on the, there, that second column there, you will have noticed that we talk about that as part of one of the themes of why things happen when they do. So what are the key themes and issues? Well, civilization marks a fundamental change in the way of life of people that are living it. We know that prehistoric civilization, that is before writing, before the advent of explaining what they were doing, and Mesolithic and Neolithic civilizations, we know that they were settling quite regularly. We know that they settled at lakesides, for example, and they had basic agriculture. I talked before about how they move around and they're nomadic and they follow their food, but they also have certain areas they go to regularly. So they would keep crops there. It makes sense to. But this is more than that. It's more than just a tribe or a group of people settling on a lakeside for a certain period of months every year, or perhaps a certain year within a period of years. This is a permanent settlement. It's building in stone. It's building permanence. It's building over several generations. If you like, it's the beginning of city-based living. It's the beginning of people living in urban conurbations and roads and living in close proximity to one another and losing the ability to essentially get away with what Neolithic and Mesolithic societies were doing, which is burying their poo. We talked about how that allowed them to survive, and it allowed them to prevent their harmful gut bacteria causing death to family members. Every human has separate gut bacteria, and it is set not at birth, though part of it is. It's set after the first food you eat, and therefore it's unique to each individual human being. Now, no one at the time knew this, but what it means is if you try to use human feces as a fertilizer, we can use feces of virtually any animal to do this. It can poison and kill people, and the larger the group of people that live together, the more chance there is of someone's poo being essentially lethal to everybody else. So when you get people living in these city-based areas for the very first time, one of the first things they have to deal with for the very first time is waste disposal. And part of the earliest point of medicine is looking at that very fundamental point. How do you deal with large amounts of humans living in a small area, and how do you deal with the human waste that is produced? So that's the beginning of city-based living. We're going to be talking about public health in many ways, which you're familiar with from your own course and what we've been doing over the last 2 years. The second thing is agriculture. One of the earliest things that denotes civilization as we are using the term is the idea of growing one's own food. You are no longer dependent on hunting, you are no longer dependent on gathering, and you grow your own food in the area in which you live. This allows for societies and for hierarchies to develop trade, to develop permanent growing facilities, and to renew that planting. So the location largely comes down to soil. I talked about climate earlier, and the climate that allows people to grow in these areas, and let's focus on the Middle East for a moment, in these areas of the river Euphrates and the river Nile, that climate spreads quite a long way around the globe. It's quite high up in the tropics. You can go quite south in Africa, quite north into Europe, and still find a very similar climate. What you can't find is the quality of soil. And the reason for that is it's dual. Mainly they have the water, but secondly they have regular floods. And the silt that comes down with those large rivers from higher up, I think is it the Atlas Mountains in the Euphrates? I'm not entirely certain. And the Nile that comes down from the southern area of Africa, they bring with them a lot of silt that then gets dropped at regular flood points, and this creates a river delta, which is this very fertile area of soil, and you probably know this from geography from year 9 and previous. And what they can do with that is they can irrigate it to keep it wet. As long as you keep it wet, it stays pretty fertile. There's lots of decaying matter in there. Black soil, loam, like that's in, like in our country. If you go into your garden, for example, and let's face it, we're under lockdown, it's easy to do, and you dig into your lawn, or you dig into anyone's lawn, you will find black, loamy soil. You can get it in your hand and you can crumble it. That is the amount of dead matter, dead animals, dead plant material, feces that lurks within, and that rotting matter, the black stuff, is what allows you to grow. The River Nile and the River Euphrates dump huge amounts of this fairly regularly. And the great thing about this soil is that it replenishes every year. So you can grow whatever you like, and then next year there's another layer of soil that you can grow whatever you like in again. If you grow, I mean, I don't know if you've ever grown stuff in your own garden. If you grow things in the same soil, you will find that the same crop cannot be grown twice. So in my own garden, I've tried to grow potatoes in the past. It's not been terribly successful. But if I try to grow 2 crops of potatoes in the same soil, it will not work. The first crop will be fine. The second crop will find exhausted soil, and they will not grow as well. So early civilizations, they went to these places where the soil was replenished so that they could grow the same crops over and over and over again, rather than trying to develop kind of, I say trying to develop, it almost implies that they're being lazy. They're not. You wouldn't think necessarily to rotate crops, for example. Crop rotation is a fairly late level development when it comes to agriculture. And it's only in the 1800s that we developed 7 forms of crop rotation, the 7 rotation system in the UK, allowing for an agricultural revolution, for example. So keep in mind that this is very early on. People are very, very low development level here. You can see, for example, on that picture over there, whoops, over there. Hold on, can I use the mouse? Oh, I can. So if we do that there, the Egyptian tomb carving showing farmers at work. And what you see there are several key innovations. You can see that they're using livestock to pull the plough. That's this bit here. That's a key innovation, the domestication of livestock. Previously, aurochs, for example, which is what we think this cattle-like animal here is, they were nomadic herds, and we followed them. These appear to be domesticated. The second thing you can see is they're growing fruit trees down the bottom here, and they know what the fruits are. They're very carefully shown the fruit. You'll notice the shape of the leaf as well. The tree is less important. You've also got around the outside here these channels of water, and these are irrigation channels. If you notice, they go between the different rows of crops as well. This means the soil is kept wet, and that allows these early farmers to grow, all year round. And I said before about the amount of crop you had to grow, so they could grow several crops of wheat and therefore stay alive and trade it. Speaking of, this idea of the boat here is technological innovation. We know that they're using boats in the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, but it allows them to trade, and more about that in a moment. So irrigation, large rivers, large lakes allow this to take place. Technology also plays a huge role here. In the Egyptian case, and we'll talk mainly about the Egyptians to begin with, they developed papyrus, the earliest form of paper. This is a form of reed that they flatten, they wet, they dry out, and it allows them to write very, very carefully. And the thing about papyrus is, in this dry climate, it tends to last for a very long time. Now, there is evidence to suggest that the Sphinx, for example, was built in a much more rainforest-style environment. This would imply that any written records from that society that lived in that area simply wouldn't survive. It was too wet, it was too humid, and papyrus simply wouldn't survive over a period of time. It has to be dry. So the earliest written records we've got come from that drying out period. There was desertification going on even then. Now, if you're interested, you can look up xkcd.com. And if you type in XKCD and climate change, you should come up with a long form graph with a couple of references to Pokemon, because obviously, that talks about world temperatures. And what you'll see there is a heating up of the globe naturally around about the time of the Egyptians. And what you'll see there also is, ancient Egyptians, and what you'll see there is that eventually caused desertification around what is modern day Egypt, allowing us as historians to look back and see the papyrus that survives, or papyri, I suppose the plural is papyri. What we find is that they mainly use writing, as I said before, for receipts. This implies that there is money and there is trade. And that's crucial. For the first time, people are trading things not on a mutual aid benefit, I help you, you help me, or I help you because of shared humanity. They're sharing things for profit. People are able to stockpile resources. Now, some people say, oh, it's from barter to money, but it's not as simple as that. What money was developed as was a token for trade. And it therefore carried the value of whatever you were trading from one place to the next without having to carry the materials. This could be metal discs, it could be anything in particular, really. I think seashells were often used as a form of exchange. Simply stealing seashells wouldn't work. They had to be marked in some way. And they were there to represent the value of the goods that you had traded, so that you could go back and buy more goods or exchange it for more goods at the same value and then take them back, and therefore you weren't carrying cargo the whole time. So once people recognize that this is a system that they can use, obviously people start stockpiling whatever it is they're using for that trade, and they begin to make themselves essentially rich. And once you start doing that, you start writing yourselves receipts, because once you do that, you want to know what you've got and what you haven't got. You want to know what the value is. You want to know how to maximize that value. So money and receipts, one of the earliest things developed when it came to writing. The other thing is, how do you take that cargo from one place to the next? And we talk about transportation, we talk about travel and contact. And here you have the Egyptian wall carving. How does this show us changes from prehistoric society? If you're doing this right, of course, you'll pause the video and have some ideas, jot some down, and then see if you're right. So, and then I start the video again and I say, oh, good answers. And I say, well, actually what it is here is you can see they're not carving them out of single logs. If you've ever been to the museum in Derby, you'll know that there is a prehistoric cargo ship, essentially, in one of the galleries. It's one of my favourite things. Well, no, not one of my favourite things. That's a lie. It's one of the favourite things of my little boy, who thinks it's brilliant. But it was carrying stone when it sank, and therefore there was clearly trade going on between those two areas, whatever those two areas might be. The Egyptians, their innovation was to use different materials. They made them mainly out of bundles of reeds and rope. The rope got wet and then it dried out, and then it tightened those reeds together and it created a watertight seal. What that allows you to do is build boats that are larger, and possibly even ships that are larger than a single trunk. And it allows them to be far lighter. And because they're lighter and they float better, you can carry more stuff in them. And because they are watertight, you can go backwards and forwards more effectively. And because they don't split over time with age like logboats do, they can keep going. And this allows people to set up regular trade routes. So one settlement might specialize in one particular area of fruit, for example, and another area might specialize in another area of wheat, for example. And those two areas can then switch the fruit for the wheat for the fruit, and so on and so forth. Once you've got that kind of contact, you start sharing ideas, which brings me on to the next point about society. We know that there's a hierarchy. I talked about the triangle shape. We know that there's a top and that there's a bottom. And part of that is down to trade, part of that is down to wealth, but part of that is down to contact and ideas. One thing that's very clear in early civilization is that people recognize when people have an idea. Now, those ideas don't necessarily follow from one generation to the next, but keep in mind how prehistoric society was organized. They did things through medicine men that was passed down from one generation to the next, and it was word of mouth. It follows, therefore, that those medicine men, seeing their base of power change and seeing people become rich in other ways, would try and cash in on that. And it follows that those people that were rich would also try and cash in on the social capital of the medicine men by trying to buy into that somehow. And what you get developing here is specialization. You get development of experts, people who do one job. In the Mesolithic and the Neolithic era, people did, well, practically all jobs. That was the whole point. You weren't proficient in everything, but you could do most jobs, because if you were left alone, you had to work on your own. In a society and a civilization, you don't need that anymore. People can develop into different jobs. And one of the earliest jobs that is developed when we're talking about medicine through time is doctors. Now, that's fascinating to me. Medicine through time is often derided as being, well, a bit of a strange point to look at for the whole of human history. And perhaps it is, but I do believe it's one of the most important. And given that doctors are one of the first things that are developed, I think it's more important than people give it credit. And certainly that's one of the reasons I loved this course. And also what you'll spot is this approach of building things up chronologically and then breaking them down thematically will allow you to access Russia later in history, and indeed most things. The next thing is what's the effect of all of this on medicine? Well, one final thing, we're talking about key innovations. We've got agriculture, we've got domestication of livestock, we've got the idea of trade and riches. We've got the idea of irrigation. We've got fruit trees. We've got writing. But also, I don't know if you've noticed, we've got religion, organized religion. Here we have the different gods. I don't know the names of any of them. I'm not an Egyptian scholar. Bembridge scholars. Sorry, that's a reference to a film you probably haven't seen, The Mummy. Watch it. It's amazing. Anyway, yeah, the immediate effects of all of this on medicine then, and how we know how these things took place, I suppose, where we end up with specialized proponents of medicine. Now, I've put doctors with a question mark. Not all societies talk about them in terms of being doctors who heal the sick. And to understand doctors in this early period, you've got to appreciate that they're not going into this solely to heal the sick. They're coming from medicine men backgrounds. They're coming from shamanistic backgrounds. They're tying in with religion. They're tying in with this spiritual, the thing that you cannot see, along with the thing that you can see. And they're taking practical, rational ways of doing things and less rational practical things, and they're molding them all together in a way that might not make sense to our modern brains. That doesn't make them wrong, by the way. It just makes them very, very different to us. They're not thick in the past. They are us. They are as highly developed as we are in terms of physiology and in terms of brain. They're as highly developed as we are in terms of the ability to think both logically and outside the box and in all other ways. That they are human beings like you or I. They're not stupid, is my point. They just think about things in a very different context, and our context is different to theirs. That doesn't make their context better. It doesn't make our context better. It makes it different, and it makes it fascinating to study. One thing is they develop languages, and those written languages allow us as historians to track where those languages go. We assume, previous to this point, people had developed language and it was verbal, and dialects turned into different languages. We don't know for certain. We're relatively certain, but we're not entirely clear. A linguistics friend of mine would be far better at this than I. The point is that written language allows people to communicate with people they have not yet seen. And even now, the reason we teach you reading and writing, the reason that schools are so hot on the idea of keeping an exercise book, is to maintain that power. Writing is power. You can transmit emotion, you can transmit ideas, you can transmit modes of thought, mimetic variations, mimetic viruses and memes can be spread in ways now that were unthinkable to the dawn of civilization. But it all stems from that shared language and the ability to write it down. If we can't translate the sounds that we make into scratches on paper, then our society would fall apart. We simply would be unable to communicate with one another. So this idea that we've got writing and the spread of ideas in a very small way will change medicine. You can probably see how this is going to go down. We're going to focus on medicine, but you can see how it can pretty much change anything. We can write things down and change people's ideas. Now, sure, I am talking to you over a video, and you might say, well, sir, you didn't write anything down for this. You haven't prepared a script, and I really haven't, which is bad form for a YouTube video, I know. But I have written this PowerPoint, and this PowerPoint does use words. And also, and this is crucial, it allows me to record what I'm thinking at any given moment. I know my PowerPoints well enough by now, and you've probably noticed how I teach. I use my PowerPoints mainly to remind me where I am. I am recording my ideas. Sometimes I even down to the jokes that I use, and I apologize about that. They don't get any better. So all of this and the ability to record ideas and share ideas and to have specific proponents for medicine or indeed any job will utterly transform the way human society works. Now, I can't remember if there isn't another one. There's a task in the books that I attached to the initial homework on the dawn of civilization and what difference it makes. As you can see, this was mainly a filler lesson, but I'm hoping that this different format will make sense and will work. If it does work, do let me know. If it doesn't, obviously let me know as well. I'm going to try and make sure that this particular video will allow comments. We'll see whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, and whether it's the first or last time that I do it, or both. My point being, I hope this has been of interest. I hope it's been something diverting, and I hope that this is a good end to, well, the Easter break. What day is it? It's Monday. So have a lovely day. Anyone who's watching, stay safe, and I shall see you in the next video. Thank you very much. Oh, I say that. I then have to do that awkward thing where I stop the recording.